Okay, guys, welcome to Livewire. I am your host, Jared Moore, as usual. And on tonight's program, we have kind of a little different format. We're going to be taking questions from the chat. We're just going to do them at the end of the presentation. And tonight we're going to have Turner Hunt. He is a tribal historic preservation officer with the MCN Historic and Cultural Preservation Department. This presentation isn't going to be anything he's doing in his official capacity, though. This is just a presentation that he gives from his research. And it's kind of like a general overview of the history going way back. So if you guys have any questions while he's giving the presentation, just pop them in the chat. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll go through and try to get as many of them asked as we can get while we still have time in the Google Meets. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mr. Hunt. Thanks for joining us tonight and giving this presentation, and take it away.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for having me. As was said earlier, this is not a part of my official capacities with the Mvskoke Creek Nation. So there's a little disclaimer I'd like to give that most of the thoughts and opinions that I express right now are my own and not the official stance of the Mvskoke Nation. Again, thanks for having me. I'm here to give a repeat presentation that I gave at the Mvskoke Art Market, just to reach out to a wider audience. And it stems from my goal of actually trying to educate as many folks about the history of our people as possible. And so when I was first asked about giving a presentation, I was like, yeah, let's talk about symbols, iconography, and myth. And then I realized that, some of that stuff is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, especially when it comes to the way that art and it gets reflected in society, so on and so forth. But what I have done is spend a number of years researching both academically and personally. I apologize. Let me turn that on silent quick. About the history of my own people. And that stems from something I'll get into a little bit, actually, because I have a couple slides about me to introduce myself to the audience for those who may not know. But my family is originally from Fame, Oklahoma. One of the key events in my life between 2005 and 2010, I spent 2 years, 3 months in Iraq as an infantryman and a contractor. I came home, used my GI Bill in order to go to the University of Oklahoma as an economics major. Luckily, I caught a flyer for the Historic and Cultural Preservation Department was putting on a symposium. They ended up doing 2 of them. I attended both of them. And this was an event where they brought in historians and academics, archaeologists from the Southeast, folks who have basically developed their whole professional careers off of researching our people. It was very enlightening, learning some of the things that they had, their perspectives. However, there's folks there. There's Creek elders there. I was sitting behind a few. They mentioned, why are there not any Creek historians? Why are there not any Creek archaeologists? And why do they keep saying Fusachahachi, or however they say it? There's a real southern twang to it, Fusachahachi. I think I'm adding an extra syllable in there, but maybe not. But, they kept having to be corrected on basic, tribal town names. And so that kind of put in perspective of, these people have built their careers and tenured degrees and all that fun jazz with academia, and they can't even pronounce our words for our tribal towns right. And so that's where I kind of fit in, wanted to go research. I knew that there was a need there. And so I spent the next 6 years at OU. I started with, that's for my undergraduate and my graduate work. Started at HCPD in September of 2018 and was appointed the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer in March of 2022. So I've done a couple of these presentations before for different entities. 2 of them from Mississippi Department of Archives and History. One of them is essentially what is the Mvskoke Nation's history and ancestral ties to the state of Mississippi. And so there's a YouTube video out there about that, as well as the Nachi diaspora, which is essentially the Nachi coming from Mississippi and becoming a constituent tribal town of the Mvskoke Nation. I also did one that was it was actually for Corps of Engineers, but the city of Savannah reached out and they asked to include it in their series Hungry for History. And so those are also available if you like to hear me talk. I get a little, I was like, ooh, Hunter's voice. Blah. But those are also out there. So this is where I get to the point where I'm talking about this name of this presentation, and where I kind of feel like I do a little switcheroo, right? So, when you're talking about symbols, meaning the meanings change throughout time. When we think about that, or the best example I think of is how a symbol can change drastically in a short period of time, is that the Oklahoma National Guard armories that were built in the 20s and 30s, they've prominently featured the swastika as their engineering and their corner blocks and their designs. Obviously, after Hitler took that symbol and made it a symbol of the Third Reich, that symbol changed very quickly. And so that's why, if we look back at our past, we have a lot of symbols and the meaning of them changes through time, throughout the environment, through the culture, through the history of what was going on. Iconography, the second part of this title. So there's a whole field of archaeology, a subfield. So anthropology, then a subfield of anthropology is archaeology, subfield of archaeology, you get into iconography. So it's a small niche group of folks that like to use a lot of analogies to help try to reconstruct the past and what symbols meant at the time. So myth, there's two different kind of ways to look at myth. The anthropological one, which is a sacred held belief. Greek mythology is Greek mythology, but it's what the people actually believed at the time. So to them, it wasn't mythology. I mean, it was mythology. It was their sacredly held beliefs. The other type of it is more the common vernacular words. Oh, that's just a myth. So you're talking about urban legend or lore, or kind of like prevailing thoughts that may not have the same significance as an origin story or a migration story, right? Exposition, it was for this audience was originally, this presentation was originally meant for an art audience, and so I was hoping to grab some people thinking that it was going to be an exposition of art, but for me, an exposition is a lengthy oration. So I apologize for the folks that have tuned in specifically for art, but it's mostly going to be me talking. Yeah. And then, of course, here we get to art finally. And, this is really, it's just a simple expression of society and culture, whether that be main culture, subculture, counterculture. They're all basically built from a perspective of within a society and culture. And then for this specific presentation, I'm going to be talking about from the late Archaic to the present. So we're kind of discussing around 5,000 years. All right, jumping right into the archaeological time periods, that 5,000 year time frame. We archaeologists break this. In order for them to understand it, they break these things up into times, and there's different characteristics for the people that would live during these times. The Archaic is immediately following the recession of the Ice Age. The glaciers have receded. Excuse me. There's a shift in more localized instead of I don't want to highly mobile organizations. They're still very highly mobile, don't get me wrong, but then you also have the woodland period, which is defined by more asceticism. One of the things that they do to break up that time frame is essentially at the end of the late Archaic is when there was the invention of pottery in North America, and some of the oldest pottery in North America is Stallings Island pottery, which Stallings Island is right near Savannah, Georgia, or excuse me, Augusta, Georgia. And it's an incredibly important site because it's the site linking our ancestors to the innovation of ceramics in North America. And so when that came about, you see a kind of a transition. People were able to do a little bit more storage, cooking capacity, and so on and so forth. And so that's where you get into woodland period. Woodland period is pre-maize. So this is before corn has arrived before Sofky. This is during a time where a lot of indigenous crops were domesticated: maygrass, sumpweed, a plethora of others, as well as sunflower and oh man, you got the sunflower seeds, and then you have Helianthus tuberosus, which is the tubes, so like potatoes. So all that was going on, and prior to that, then maize arrives as you get a much larger population. We move into this what they call the Mississippian period. They break history up based off of events. So 1540 is usually that time because that's contact with Europeans, and so that's when we have this historic Creek phase. And the way that I also kind of move through this presentation, there's a timeline on the bottom of the slides as we move through in order to just keep everyone focused of how old or how young or what time period we're in. It'll light up. And that's just to help keep track of 5,000 years. That's a long time. And of course, it's a lot longer here. But so one of the things that was happening during the Archaic period, again, this is the invention of pottery. What we have over here, or at least on the left figure, this is done by Dr. Carrie Garland, who I'll mention later, friend of the department, works with us in our field school, has done a lot of work on the archaeological past of Georgia and along the coast. And so, what does a shell ring look like? What does it represent? And how does that fit in with our culture? And so luckily, or I was lucky enough, maybe 2 years ago, to participate in an international article about the management of oysters during this time. And so, we look back at what some of our folks had said throughout time. They recount the migration myths from the West. There's one specifically recounted by Legis Perryman, where he talks about how when we got to the ocean and we couldn't pass anymore, we noticed that the tide came in and out. And basically there's oysters. So that's and they stopped there and they lived there. And so the age of some of these rings are contemporaneous with the pyramids in Egypt. This is an incredibly long time ago. And the way that these things are preserved is because the shell rings themselves actually change the composition of the soil. And so a lot of the things that we know from this time period are either from things that were preserved in the shell because it didn't decompose like it normally would, or it's part of that ceramic tradition that I told you about. And so we'll get more onto what exactly we look at when we may look at and view art in the Archaic period. But you move from the Archaic period to the Woodland period. This is 1000 BCE to 1000 BCE. And there's some wiggle room on all of these. And it's unique because I worked a lot reviewing things in Georgia, and then you read something from Alabama, and the archaeologists in Alabama look at time differently than the archaeologists in Georgia, and so you got to kind of rectify some of these things. But essentially, the Woodland period, larger villages occupied year-round. They practiced that horticulture that I was telling you about with the Southeastern Agricultural Complex, the domestication of numerous crops that were later replaced. They still stuck around. But maize was a much more efficient crop. And so that's when you move into maize agriculture. But the long distance trade networks that folks like to brag about during the Mississippi, it actually is very prevalent during the Woodland period. We call this, look at me again, acting like an archaeologist. So you have the Hopewellian interaction sphere, the Hopewell mounds, the Serpent Mound up in, oh my gosh, I want to say Kentucky. That's part like the center of the Hopewellian interaction sphere, that it was completely active in creeklands. You have sites as far down the Chattahoochee River as oh my gosh, I can't remember county, but it's past the fall line, south of the fall line. Kolomoki was involved in that Hopewellian interaction sphere. But they also, in Georgia, they did large stone mounds in the form of effigies. And then, of course, one of the hallmarks of the next period is pyramid mounds. And, of course, that happened earlier in the Woodland period as well. This image over here on the right That's Kolomoki Mounds. And what's unique about some of the archaeology done in that is that it was a painted mound, white clay, red clay, and they alternated on either side. And so, a lot of times we talk about the red-white divisions, and that's another thing that's essentially a symbol, and it changes through time. Sometimes it meant to represent the older tribe, sometimes it meant to mean the victorious tribe, sometimes it meant other things. But one of the things that is consistent is the division between East and West. And so if we use that as red-white towns, so that's kind of what was essentially happening during that time. Groups were coming together, obviously large communities from a spread out for seasonal events. Some of this stuff starts very familiar because it picks up. One of the most, I would call it one of the most important sites. They're all important, but the leak site is fortunate because it's a sad story. When we say it's fortunate because we learn a lot about it, it's usually because it was destroyed. And that is the case with Leak Site. Leak Site was destroyed to make way for a highway, but it was located in Northwest Georgia. And it is basically a hub for trade across all of Eastern North America. You could go basically 20, 30, 40 miles in any direction and jump into a major river valley and follow that all the way to specific trade areas. And it worked both ways. So this slide is meant to highlight a few sites that were contemporaneous with the Leak Site, all within creek lands. This is the Leak Site. It's the arrow with the star. This is Cold Spring Site, which is a large council house. I've worked with University of Georgia on some of the earliest institutions of democracy in North America, and we base a lot of it off of the information from the Cold Spring Site. Swift Creek Village is there in Macon near Omogi, and then this down here is that Kolomoki site that I was telling you about, much further down in Georgia than what most people think would be a part of the Hopewellian interaction sphere. This is where we transition from woodland to Mississippian. Etowah, or Edowa, is a site in Northwest Georgia that many people describe as folks moving in from very far away. There is some evidence of Eastern Tennessee. I'm not going to deny that. There's a huge Muskogean presence at that time in Eastern Tennessee. But some of the things that may get left out is that it is nearly just 2 miles away from the Leak Site, which was an incredibly popular hub just a couple hundred years earlier. And so, this is where I like to make that transition from, there was, a mountain site that had large trade networks that spanned North America, to the Mississippian period, which is defined by large networks with mounds, large extensive trade networks. So it's really not that, it's a very gray line there when they're talking about these transitions from the woodland period into the Mississippian period. But when we talk about this this time, it's really kind of good to get into a little bit of the linguistics. So in anthropology, there's 4 subgroups: archaeology, bioarch, socioculture, and linguistics. A lot of times linguistics gets kind of left out, but our language is very important to our culture. We've invested a lot in language, and so for us to focus on the linguistic aspects is a no-brainer. But what we look at is, at one point in time, there was a Proto-Muskogean language. This is a language that eventually separated into the different dialects that we know today. The Choctaw Chickasaw under the Western, under Eastern, you have Alabama, Cosati, Hijiti, and Mvskoke Creek and Seminole. There's other ones that are no longer spoken: Nachi, Appalachee, all Muskogean dialects. And there's differing opinions on how old this language would be. But one of the things that you need to keep in mind is that the Muskogean language is the only language that's wholly indigenous to the Southeast, meaning that it evolved, it began in the Southeast. And so the time that you could see it can be short as some of the differences between Choctaw Chickasaw separating around 1450, excuse me, to some of the differences being non-mutually intelligible, so that they could be the differences between 3 to 5,000 years. So on the conservative side, you have 3,000 years. On the other side, you have 5,000 years. Either way, that kind of puts you in both those transitional periods between late Archaic into the Woodland period and the Woodland period into the Mississippian. And I think I just got those dates wrong on my head, but it makes sense when I explained it right the first. So again, based off of some of the language families in this map is essentially one of those maps that we created to help explain what things look like in 1540. So around the time that European contact, this is where some of those groups were. Each area has kind of a rather large ancestral site associated with it. Moundville is important to Casita, Coweta, all of the Alabama towns. You also have the Big Eddy Mounds. It's right there at the heart of Alabama's stuff. Etowah, Okmulgee, Singermoy, Roots Landing, Lake Jackson, Hiawassee Island up in Cosati area. And Winterville, after contact, these folks moved down to this area here where the Nachi are in this map. And so that's kind of explaining some of those sites associated with some of the groups that we know of as part of the Creek Nation, Creek Confederacy. This slide is developed to kind of show you what I meant by some of the hallmarks. There's no real way to define Mississippians. So what they do is they try to be like, okay, well, did they have shell-tempered pottery? Did they practice maize agriculture? Did they have extensive trade networks? Did they have regalia? So these are all kinds of things to kind of clue that in. Of one particular note is this picture up here, which is a photo taken in the 1930s when they were excavating Okmulgee. And I find it fascinating because, there's every Thanksgiving you get this story about, the Pilgrims and Native folks teaching them how to farm, and you make little mounds and you put the fish in there. And then, you also see a lot of things about the three sisters being mounded together. In Creek country, there was ridge and furrows. So pretty much in the South, when we grew corn, we grew it the same way that we grow it today, in ridge and furrows. So there wasn't a whole lot of mounding of those things. Now they still planted interspersed corn, beans, and squash. Don't get me wrong, but it was very much a ridge and furrows thing. I don't know. I'm a plant person, so I get really excited about things like that. Exactly. But yeah, so these are the kind of things that hallmarks of Mississippianization that folks look for when they're trying to describe a Mississippian site. So as I mentioned earlier, Etowah, just down the road, 2 miles to the road. It's actually the river. So up the river 2 miles or so, probably a little bit further if you go by water, but very important site. It kind of waned in population around 1350 to 1450. So folks basically moved to another area. When DeSoto came along, that place where Etowah folks had all moved to essentially is known as the Little Egypt site, but it's the heart of Coosa. And so the Coosa chiefdom or whatever is based out of Northwest Georgia, and they're the descendants of Etowah, and they're the ancestors of many tribal towns of Creek Nation, including Hickorygram. So one of the sites that we don't mention very much is Winterville because it's in Mississippi, and folks just don't know the connection between Winterville and the Creek Nation. But this is a multi-mountain site that is one of the ones that it helps really paint a picture later when we get into some of the kind of things with the churches, and I'll caveat all that in a minute. But having a central location and then the campgrounds around it, it's a good one. As a matter of fact, we don't have to wait too very far. So also, I talked about Moundville being a very important site. it's something that I've had to invest a lot of time in learning about Moundville, learning about our ties to it, when people left, the connections that they had, how that mechanism is working, where they went, and so understanding that Casita Coweta migrated, part of their migration story, their oral histories talk about leaving a place, and it's, for all intents and purposes, by archaeology standards, as Moundville. And so, not to mention, the folks of Alabama towns that are within the nation. There's direct relationship between them and Moundville. So, didn't want to point that out because it's a very important site. We continue to know its sacredness and importance to our nation. Omogi is an amazing place. I'm fortunate enough next week, I'm going to do a little plug. Next week, I'll be out there teaming up with the University of Georgia for an archaeological field school. This is our second year. And what we're doing, that's the next slide, but essentially the prevailing thoughts in archaeology on Georgia, on Omogi, was that there was an arrival around 900, and then around 1100 people left. They moved around a little bit, and so essentially, this place wasn't that important until much later in time, when around 1695, when Casita Coweta and a number of tribal towns relocated to the Omogi. And so what that did, and this is a new slide. This is a slide that I've worked with and presented at the Southeastern Archaeological Conference. This is some of the work that I do in my official capacity, but talk about it here. So the nation purchased 126 acres in Georgia, known as Brown's Mount. It contains mound sites, council house sites, just like the ones found at Omogi. And so, what we developed was an entire landscape plan, because the whole area is important. It's about 5 miles from the mounds, and it's directly in between Lamar Mounds, which is where folks were living when DeSoto came. Described it, Spiral Mound. Yep, that's Spiral Mound in the middle of the swamp. Yep, it's in the middle of the swamp. And so understanding where people were along the entire, and finding out when they arrived. So we are able to do things like, find a piece of charcoal, use AMS dating, and of course, you're like, yeah, it's going to give us a great date. But then it gives you a date and you're like, man, there's more questions. So, we've gone through this painstaking process with Georgia, with the collaboration of National Park Service, to kind of reevaluate the times. And some of the stuff that we're finding is amazing. There's no deoccupation in 1100. There's from when folks arrived to when folks essentially left in 1715, there's continuous habitation. And so one of the things the Smithsonian has specifically done in the past is separate our historic Creek ancestors from our Mississippian period ancestors. And so what we're showing through this type of research is that they're all the same. They're all of our ancestors. So I did want to hit that out before I lead into one of the major reasons why I do the work that I do. It's stressful, but it's important, and you get put in unique situations. I've grown up as a Creek citizen, always knowing about the desecration of hickory ground by the porch. And with permission, I was able to, I asked permission to use this photo because a lot of people don't quite fully understand. Now, not to mention that the human burials that were desecrated and removed, which is just uncalled for and despicable. But the fact that they have the site and they turned it into a casino, but this area here representing the Four Arbors and then the Rotunda is something that I want you to keep in mind, because this is the representation of that culture and the society that the art that I'll discuss comes from. And I'll make some more allusions to the importance of hickory ground site later. So one of the things that I like to do is I like to show some images of churches, Mvskoke Creek churches, historic churches. Some folks call them traditional churches. I'll leave it at that. But one of the things that I will do is, they're an analogy. So one of the things that Christianity did is it came in and it used Greek religion, Greek ideas, Greek culture, and modified it towards Christianity. So you still have locations where people came, instead of coming to Green Court, now they're coming to Revival. They're still going camping for 2 weeks. They have their camp houses there that are, their mothers and their sisters take it over after, same kind of systems that set up the same way that people use the space around them. And so that's the reason why these images, I show these images, is because they're not ceremonial grounds. They're a closed public analogy for the ceremonial grounds. The difference is that the ceremonial grounds goal is to replicate and continue to reproduce Greek culture, while the churches is to Christianize. And so different end games, but they adapt our usage of space in the same way. So moving to art, some of these things on here are not Greek. I want to spell that at the first, because the reason why I show them is because they're of objects that would not persist underneath the dirt. So moving on, you have art is basically, you break it down into 3 ways. So you have an expression of some form. You have the medium in which you're putting it in, whether that be clay, shell, stone, sandstone, chipped rock, all kinds of different mediums that are out there, mediums that we don't even know of because they don't persist for long. And then that leads us into the next one. What is actually preserved after 3,000 years, after 5,000 years, after 250 years, after 10 years being buried in a spot? What actually is there for us to talk about art in the past? And so when we talk about, I basically just went through all 3 of these slides, but expression, it's the act of creating something based off of one's cultural setting. Medium, the physical type of materials used to create that expression. Copper is another one. And then preservation, so what remains after hundreds of years or thousands of years in temperate and sometimes acidic environment. And that's why I was talking about with the shell, is that the shell takes the soil, which is acidic, and turns it into a basic, so things don't decompose as well. So archaeologists, when they look back at the past and they're talking about, what are these things, what do they represent? They're dealt with a preservation bias. So you're only able to look at what is actually still left. And so things that normally do not last very long, wood, fir, twine, river cane, and how that, works out in art, mass tapestries. I've heard these tapestries would be made of like rabbit hair that could be twined with thistle. And so they'd be very, very exterior, but very, very fragile. And so, of course, they don't persist very long. The only way that they were able to see that is through like phytolithic analysis. So you're looking at very, very decomposed. That's off the side. So this is where I kind of want to move into the art part. So, what remains in archaic sites from 3,000, 5,000 years ago? Under only unique circumstances do things preserve, or things are of a material that does not decompose very much. And so how do people express themselves during that time? We have, during this late archaic period, we have the Stalintines pottery, and it's fiber pottery. So you take clay, and then you need to add something to it. And so what they did is they took moss from the tree, oh my gosh, I can't even think of that. It's all the stuff that grows, Spanish moss, yeah. And they'd take that and they'd work it into the clay. And so when you fire the vessel, it prevented cracks from forming. So you'd have lots of micro cracks, but no big cracks. But that wasn't good enough for our ancestors. They wanted to add some flair. So you see different types of representation, adding switch cane, taking it off, punching it in, decorating it. Fingernail impressions. It's unique. You can see fingernail impressions from people, from our ancestors 3,000 years ago. Shell impressions, so they take those shells and have the point and the scroll and just punch them in over and over. So even at this time, where we're talking a long time ago, maybe the very start of our language, people are still expressing themselves and expressing the ways in what we would consider today as art. Woodland art. There's a bunch. There's all different types of ways in which people express themselves, including groundstone, beautiful pipes. A lot of this stuff I would like to show, but I need an artist to draw it. So a lot of these things are taken from funerary context, and so I try to not show things that are taken from funerary context. But part of this woodland art is an expression in their paddles that they use to press into the clay. And so you would have these um, beautiful sand tempered vessels that have been worked. And I haven't mentioned this before. This is women's work. This is the art of our women. This is, we have a gender division of labor. We have community practice. So mother taught their daughter how to make this pottery. And that's why it persisted in these traditions for 200, 300, 500 years. And so, yeah, this is one of those amongst enormous amount of different ways in which people express themselves. The pottery, this is kind of one of the hallmarks of that period. There's another pottery tradition that's pervasive, and this is a Weeden Island pottery. This is very intricate, and this shows up south of a lot of places where you have a boundary between linguistic zones. So you have a pottery tradition that clearly, that to me, represents that even communities speaking different languages were trading and talking to each other, marrying and all kinds of stuff. And so even at this time, this early time, you have these communities that aren't necessarily bound by a language, that are, trading and enjoying the best life, I think. Coming back to this slide again, and this is just again to point out some of those important Mississippian sites as we moved into this Mvskokean art. There's a lot, and the reason why we see a lot more during this time period is because of that, what I mentioned earlier. This is when maize agriculture became full blown. And so you had a larger population that didn't have to work nearly as hard as what they used to work in the previous generations, because corn yielded so much more. And so people had more time to sit around, to invest in their arts and the way that they express themselves. And that's why you see, like, a woodland site is not any different than a Mississippian site, other than that you've added, 1,000 people, and now, instead of just being able to do little bits, you're able to do a lot more. And so you have this kind of development of these art traditions that are in shell, are in copper. The way they make the shell is from these left-handed lightning whelks, which are only available in the Gulf of Florida, Gulf Coast of Mexico, excuse me. Gulf of Mexican coast, Gulf Coast. Let's just do that. Yeah. And so, you find these left-handed whelks all the way in Spiro, Oklahoma. So that means that trade networks are going from creek lands in Florida all the way to Caddo lands and ancestral Wichita lands in Oklahoma, modern day Oklahoma. So again, pretty extensive. This is one of those myths. I said I'd throw one of those in there just to give us some general things. So, I see this a lot, even on social media. A lot of time, people defending certain things like, well, pre-contact North America was a violent place, and there's all kinds of, they were just fighting all the time. And then there's the more academic approach, and they see some of the imagery, and they're like, well, this art represents warfare, and so. There's also this iceberg thing. I didn't create this. This is something that somebody else created. I thoroughly enjoy it, and I like to share it. So kudos whoever did. But essentially, archaeologists are limited in what they can say about things because they only have access to the material culture. While folks, the indigenous folks, Muskogean folks, we have our language, our government, our histories, our families, our kin, our tribal towns. There's all kinds of things that we have that help us better understand that culture than somebody from the outside with just a limited view, not purview. So take, for example, I've seen this expressly, or I've seen this discussed in different ways. But you have a stone palette from Moundville. This is not the palette. I drew that myself. There's some art in here. Hey. And then there's Etowah shell portrait, and they have kind of conflicting imagery. While you have this, what is called a butterfly with a long tongue, long proboscis, I believe, not proboscis, but long tongue. You'll notice the spots along the wings and the forked tail. And then this character from Etowah is grabbing a character with spots on its wings and a long tongue and a forked tail. And so some folks see this as signs of conflict and competition. So without knowing exactly what those stories were and what the art and the culture, like what they were actually trying to represent there is no actual way to say that this was violence. And it's more prevalent in something like this. I've read a number of different takes on this from a number of people, some qualified, some not so qualified, but you want to see what some people think about stuff regardless. And so you have two different groups, the Star Eyes and I can't remember what they called the other ones. But essentially there's two groups here that they're depicting in combat. There's some other warriors in the back possibly arriving. But to prove this example of indigenous culture iceberg, you can kind of look at it and you're like, well, medicine man makes medicine. And he sits down and he blows into a thing. So, that's a hill is high. And, that kind of looks like Miko. And then, there's a big warrior. So that's maybe the Dustin Flacco. And then, Hinaha, and that looks like an arbor over there with folks in it. And so you realize that like some of the things that outsiders would look at and immediately be like, oh, this is conflict and warfare. You're thinking, oh, this is East-West. And they're, this is not anything out of, this is just what somebody's seeing. They're depicting what they're seeing, and it doesn't seem to be conflict. So I did this again at an art market, hoping to reach out to some artists, because this is not an academic, but as somebody who does this enough, I've seen kind of this weird loop, this negative feedback loop. I call it a negative feedback loop. But so archaeology in the 1930s through the 1970s essentially excavated a whole bunch of stuff and didn't talk to anybody about it. When they excavated this stuff, they have to make these interpretations and they make assumptions on what that means. They write it in a book. Our folks and any folks nowadays can get inspired by some of the stuff about their culture, about their past. And then they find this information in a book, and it has those archaeologists' assessments of what that meaning was. And then the kind of weird thing that's like, it's not bad and it's not good. And that's why maybe I do this morning, is because there's also been a very intense interest in archaeology on Native artists. So their subject is Native artists. And so they want them to come talk about their art. They want them to come show their art. And so sometimes what happens is a thing where the meaning gets translucent and then repeated, and it creates a loop. This is also happens in ethnographies. A lot of John Swanton's stuff is taken by, state recognized tribes in our homelands, and they're like, oh, what the Creeks do, so this is what we got to do. So, we see this happen. And so it's just a simple warning to put out there that watch out for them archaeologists. So again, we're making this transition from Mvskokean art in that pre-contact period into post-contact period. Again, a lot of the stuff that we see, man.
I'm just going to jump in really quick, Turner. We're getting close to time. I haven't got a time warning yet. I just wanted to let the audience know that we are getting close to time. If you guys have a question, pop it in the chat, and if we have leftover time, we will ask it. And if not, I'm going to just let Mr. Hunt try to get as far as we can get. I haven't got a time warning yet, but I'm expecting it any time now. So, but yeah, go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
No problem. I apologize because I got started late too. What happened, is that post-contact. When people describe ceramics, they talk about, there was a drop off in production or this or that, or the artistic value declined. Some things they say is a little bit condescending, but they're missing the fact that the medium had just changed. And so instead of needing to express yourself in pottery and stuff, now folks had fabric and beads and bright colors. And so they started expressing themselves in things that, we see today and different things. Going to do lightning round. Cultural continuity. Essentially, our ancestors taught us things. It's passed down generation to generation. This man's blowing that lightning whelk from the Gulf Coast in Oklahoma. So again, those things. Want to hit back on that kind of. It's not the reason why hickory ground is important, but the destruction of hickory ground and the fact that it is a pre-removal site that is an example of our culture. And you have the Singer Moy site in Georgia that is almost identical, and it was abandoned in 1450. And so the traditions that hickory ground was doing are traditions that were practiced in 1100, and they're traditions that are practiced to this current day. The rest of these slides are more of those comparisons between mound sites. This one right here, hickory ground number 2, is quite alarming. The I'm looking for that word. I can't say it anymore. But yeah. So again, these are all just various places that show the way in which we use sites. To be honest, has been pretty constant. We're conservative creeks for a reason, and the way that we use space, the way that we organize our social selves, doesn't change. And pretty much the last slide on that is, the Earth Lodge at Macon Plateau at Omogi, and our mound building for the Supreme Court and our National Council. Same processes that occurred 1,000 years ago are the same processes occurring to right now. So with that, Mvskoke.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Turner. I didn't get a time warning. Let me come in here for you guys. I didn't get a time warning, so if you guys have any questions, this is your opportunity. I'm not stepping on your toes, right, Mr. Hunt? We're open for questions.
We're good.
And if this meeting does just turn off out of nowhere, it wasn't me. It was Google. But it looked we should have gotten a time warning by now, and we haven't got one. So maybe they've changed it to where you have unlimited time. I did want to mention to you that I'm so glad to hear somebody, as somebody who's also looked at this iconography and stuff, mentioned that who was writing these theories about what these symbols mean is very important, especially when you realize that a lot of them, they may have some, have read some oral histories or something done by Swanton or somebody else, or some of that stuff, but they weren't immersed in the culture. And there are things that are in the symbols that you can obviously see are related to things that are in the culture if you know anything about what happens at the ceremonial grounds or any of those processes. So it's great to see that out there in the world. That's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the program to give your presentation. And also, I had a lot of artists, citizens, that were contacting me, and they were like, I wanted to get to Mr. Hunt's presentation, but I couldn't because I was selling or whatever, at the show. So also wanted to get out there. And I wanted to mention to you guys too, I mentioned this in yesterday's live wire, but we also had Mr. Scott Hale's presentation on our YouTube channel. And he emailed me and said that he hadn't gotten permission from some of the artists for their work to be put online. So that's why we took that video down. He's working with them to get the permissions cleared up. And then once we get all that stuff cleared up, we'll bring it back if you're like, what happened to that video? Because that video was getting a lot of views too. So I was giving you guys a heads up is we have his presentation from the art market too, but we've got to get some permissions cleared, and then we'll pop it back up for you guys. So.
This is all original artwork by Turner Hunt, so you have my
all right, awesome. So is there anything you'd like to add? I don't see any questions popping up.
I talked a little bit about a field school that's going on in Georgia next week. My goal, I've always, the design from the very get-go when these conversations first came up was to get Creek citizens involved, young folks involved in learning about this process, because I may look young, but I need to be training my replacement. We need young people and Creek folks who are interested in archaeology and in the past, to kind of channel to our office, because we need our office. We need more folks to sit around and kind of reshape the narrative around our own past. All those books and all those excavations that they've done, they've created all these narratives, and so it's really our own kind of our own responsibility to go out there and be like, it should be, if you want to know Creek history, you need to talk to Creek people about that. And so it's kind of repositioning and taking that control back of the narrative. And so I hope that we can get some more publicity for it, and next year we can do some outreach to make sure that we get any Creek citizens that are interested, students that are interested in learning about archaeology, involved in that, and get to go see our homelands in our TCP, traditional cultural place. It's a regulatory designation, but it means it's an important place, and Creek citizens don't get to see that very often. So I'm looking forward to bringing that more to the mainstream.
If there is a young person that's watching this, they want to get involved, what do they do? What's the best way to get to you guys?
Ooh, that's a great question, because usually I'd be like, email us, but my email is horrible. There's going to be, I'm waiting for hear back from the college. So if there's anyone from the college watching, we're hoping to come. The field school students are coming from Georgia to Creek Nation to visit the reservation. I'll be here the week of June 6th to the 10th, and we'd really like to do some type of collaborative thing out at the college, do a poster session, share, and those kind of things. So I don't even know where we got into that, but that's where we want to try to do that outreach and get with those college students and stuff.
Awesome. Okay, great. Well, and also, if you can't make that event and you're a young person out there, you want to get involved, you can shoot me an email too, and I'll keep you tapped in with everything that I find out that's going on. I can give you Turner's email, and we can do it that way. So, and you guys know my email is jmoore@mvskokemedia.com, or you could shoot me a message in YouTube or wherever else, or Facebook or anything else. So we take a look at everything. I want to thank you for giving this presentation tonight, sir, and I want to thank you guys for tuning in and watching it. And I don't have anything on my schedule coming up, any live streams scheduled. I will probably be doing a video on the 17th is the senior games, so I'll be going and checking that stuff out. And we might have a lawyered up next week, depending on if there's any developments. So you guys keep your ears open, and we'll see you later. Chit chat, Lise.